The Iron Inferno. In September 1327, a deposed king faced a death so terrible that chroniclers spoke of it in whispers for centuries. Edward II had ruled England for 20 troubled years before his wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer orchestrated his removal from the throne. The fallen king was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, a cold stone fortress in Gloucestershire where few could hear his cries. Initially, Edward's captors tried to break him through deliberate neglect. According to contemporary accounts, they placed him in a cell beneath the castle, where sewage from an animal pit deliberately flowed into his chamber. Historians believe they intended the filth and stench would cause disease and a seemingly natural death. When Edward survived these conditions, his captors grew impatient. On the night of September 21st, Lord Berkeley suspiciously left the castle, leaving Edward in the hands of two men, Thomas Gurney and John Maltravers. What happened next was reconstructed from scattered accounts and the screams heard throughout the castle that night. The two men overpowered the former king and forced him face down onto a bed. According to the chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker, they held Edward down and inserted a horn device into his rectum. Through this horn, they inserted a red-hot iron poker. The heated metal burned through his internal organs while leaving no visible marks on his body. The iron rod seared his intestines and reached his vital organs. Edward remained conscious during the initial moments, his screams echoing through the stone corridors. Witnesses reported hearing howls so terrible that other prisoners wept. The pain would have been unimaginable as his internal tissues charred and ruptured. Death did not come quickly. For minutes that must have felt like hours, Edward experienced his body cooking from the inside. When the screaming finally stopped, the killers likely waited to ensure he was truly dead, before reporting that the former king had succumbed to a sudden illness. Edward's body was displayed publicly to show no external wounds, but the truth of his suffering could not remain hidden. The exploding corpse. In September 1087, one of history's most feared warriors, William the Conqueror, faced a humiliating end that began with a battlefield injury, not from an enemy, but from his own horse. William I, the Norman king who had conquered England 21 years earlier, was leading a punitive expedition against the French town of Mantes. At 59 years old, he was still an imposing figure, though his body had grown corpulent with age and luxury. During the assault, William's horse suddenly reared, driving the iron pommel of his saddle deep into the king's abdomen. The impact ruptured William's intestines, causing immediate and excruciating pain. Unable to continue fighting, the king was carried to a nearby priory in Rouen where physicians recognized the severity of his injuries. Medieval medicine had no answer for such internal trauma. For 6 agonizing weeks, William lay sweating and feverish as infection spread throughout his abdominal cavity. The once mighty conqueror could not eat or drink without causing fresh waves of torment. His abdomen swelled as gases built up from the damaged intestines, stretching his skin to a grotesque tightness. On September 9th, William finally succumbed to the infection, but his suffering did not end with death. As was customary for royalty, his body was to be interred in a stone sarcophagus at St. Stephen's Abbey in Caen. By the time the funeral procession arrived, the king's corpse had spent days in the summer heat. The body had bloated to an enormous size, the abdominal tissues breaking down and filling with gas. When monks attempted to force the swollen corpse into a sarcophagus that was too small, the pressure became too great. William's abdomen suddenly burst open with an audible pop, releasing intestinal contents and putrefied tissue. The stench was so overwhelming that mourners gagged and fled the church. The burial service was hastily completed by a few monks who covered their faces with their robes, trying not to breathe the noxious air that had once been their king. The hidden Privy murder. On February 21st, 1437, the tranquility of the Dominican friary in Perth was shattered by the sounds of violence. King James I of Scotland, a 42-year-old monarch known for his poetry and harsh justice, had been staying at the monastery. Earlier that evening, he had been chatting with the queen and her ladies when a sudden commotion of armed men was heard outside. The king immediately recognized the danger. This was no random disturbance, but a coordinated assassination attempt led by Sir Robert Graham, a nobleman James had previously exiled. In desperation, James looked for an escape route. The chamber windows were securely barred, and the only exit would lead directly to his attackers. According to the chronicle, The Deethy of the King of Scotus, James made a frantic decision to pry up the floorboards and drop into a hidden space below. What he didn't realize was that this space was actually a small sewage drain that led to the monastery's privy, a toilet that emptied directly into a cesspit. Even worse, James had ordered this drain sealed days earlier to prevent tennis balls from being lost there during games in the courtyard. The assassins burst into the royal apartments, finding the queen and her attendants, but no king. They might have left, frustrated, had James not attempted to pull himself out of the cramped, fetid space. The noise alerted the killers, who followed the sound to the privy chamber. Looking down through the open floor, they spotted the trapped monarch. Unable to defend himself in the confined space, James could only watch as Graham's men jumped down with daggers drawn. The king was stabbed repeatedly, suffering 16 wounds to his chest alone. As the daggers pierced vital organs, James struggled weakly, his body wedged in the narrow drain. His blood flowed down into the cesspit below, mingling with the monastery's waste. The king who had ruled Scotland for 13 years died like a trapped animal, his final moments spent in a space of human filth. Emperor's Golden Curse. In the summer of 260 AD, a 66-year-old Roman emperor faced a fate that no ruler of Rome had ever experienced before. Valerian, who had risen from aristocratic roots to command the most powerful empire on earth, led his army against the Persian forces near Edessa in modern-day Turkey. The battle ended in disaster. Valerian wasn't just defeated, he was captured alive by King Shapur I of Persia, becoming the only Roman emperor ever taken as a prisoner of war. For Shapur, this unprecedented captive presented an opportunity to demonstrate Persian dominance. According to the Christian historian Lactantius, Valerian's initial humiliation was psychological. The emperor, who had once been addressed as a living god, was forced to kneel whenever the Persian king mounted his horse. Shapur used Valerian's back as a human footstool, placing his boot on the Roman's neck before stepping into the stirrup. Witnesses reported that the once mighty emperor's face showed the vacant stare of a man whose spirit had already died, but physical torment would soon follow. After months of such degradation, Shapur reportedly grew tired of his royal prisoner. He ordered a demonstration that would send a message throughout the ancient world. According to Persian accounts, Valerian was restrained and forced to watch as executioners heated a crucible of gold until the metal became molten. The elderly emperor understood his fate only moments before his head was pulled back and his jaw forced open. The executioners poured the liquid gold, heated to over 1,900 degrees Fahrenheit, directly down his throat. The molten metal would have instantly cauterized his lips, tongue, and esophagus. As it reached his stomach, the gold would have caused catastrophic internal burns before cooling and solidifying inside his body. Death came within seconds, but not before unimaginable agony. Shapur wasn't finished with the emperor's remains. Court records indicate that Valerian's corpse was flayed, the skin carefully removed from the body and preserved with cedar oil. This human pelt was reportedly dyed imperial purple and displayed in a Persian temple as a permanent reminder of Rome's humiliation. The Inbred King's Rotting Autopsy. On November 1st, 1700, the last Habsburg king of Spain drew his final labored breath in Madrid's royal Alcazar. Charles II, just 38 years old, had been dying since the day he was born. The product of generations of royal inbreeding, his parents were uncle and niece, Charles embodied the catastrophic genetic consequences of Habsburg marriage policies. Court physicians had documented his condition throughout his life, creating one of history's most disturbing medical records. From infancy, Charles showed signs of severe genetic disorders. His Habsburg jaw and extreme prognathism was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth could not meet, making chewing impossible. Food had to be prepared in liquid form. His tongue was oversized for his mouth, causing constant drooling and making speech difficult. Witnesses at court described how bodily fluids continuously leaked from his mouth, requiring attendants to wipe his face every few minutes. By his 30s, Charles could barely walk. His legs were too weak to support his frail body and his spine curved painfully. He suffered from seizures that courtiers attributed to demonic possession. Physicians recorded episodes where he would suddenly fall, his body contorting as foam bubbled from his lips. These seizures increased in frequency during his final months, sometimes occurring multiple times in a single day. In October 1700, Charles collapsed completely. For 3 days, his body fought against its genetic fate. The autopsy that followed revealed a body that defied medical understanding. The physicians who examined him wrote that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. Most disturbing to the doctors was the complete absence of a brain, the cranial cavity instead filled with a clear watery fluid. The official report concluded that Charles had been repeatedly hexed, as physicians could not explain how a body so malformed had survived for 38 years. As news of the autopsy spread, European courts received confirmation of what many had long suspected. The Spanish king had never truly been alive in any meaningful sense, but rather a walking exhibition of dynastic decay. The Rotten King. In 4 BC, the tyrant king who had ruled Judea for over 3 decades confronted an enemy he couldn't defeat, his own decaying body. Herod, the 69-year-old monarch notorious for his construction of the Second Temple and the alleged massacre of the innocents, had long suffered from paranoia and violent mood swings. But the symptoms that began in the spring of that year were different, marking the start of what would become one of antiquity's most excruciating deaths. According to the historian Josephus, Herod's illness began with an intense itching that spread across his entire body. The sensation was so unbearable that the king would rake his fingernails across his skin until it bled. Yet even this self-mutilation provided no relief. Within weeks, his lower extremities began to swell with fluid, a condition physicians now recognize as severe edema. His feet expanded to nearly twice their normal size, making each step an exercise in agony. By summer, the most horrific symptom emerged. Herod's genitals became gangrenous, developing what Josephus described as putrefied and worm-infested sores. The infection created a breeding ground for maggots that literally consumed his reproductive organs while he was still alive. The stench became so overpowering that servants vomited when entering his chambers. Court physicians attempted treatments including warm baths in oil and various herbal poultices, but nothing slowed the progression of the disease. As his organs continued to fail, Herod suffered from constant shortness of breath. Each inhalation became a struggle, causing him to sit upright day and night, gasping for air. Convulsions seized his body at irregular intervals, causing him to cry out in pain. 5 days before his death, in a moment of clarity amid his delirium, Herod attempted suicide, grabbing a knife from a servant bringing him an apple. His cousin stopped him before he could plunge the blade into his chest, forcing him to endure his remaining days of torment. Even in his final hours between labored breaths, Herod ordered the execution of his own son, Antipater, revealing that his cruelty survived even as his body dissolved. Death, when it finally came, wasn't merciful, but merely the end point of a biological collapse so complete that contemporary witnesses considered it divine punishment. The tortured Maratha king. On March 11, 1689, the capital of the Mughal Empire witnessed a public spectacle of unprecedented brutality. Sambhaji Bhosale, the 31-year-old king of the Maratha Empire and son of the legendary warrior Shivaji, had been captured after nearly a decade of fierce resistance against Mughal forces. Emperor Aurangzeb, who had pursued the young king relentlessly, now had his prize. But simple execution was deemed insufficient for a man who had caused the deaths of thousands of Mughal soldiers. Sambhaji's ordeal began in the central square of Bahadurgarh. According to contemporary Persian chronicles, he was paraded through streets on a camel, dressed in a clown's motley with bells tied to his hands and feet. The humiliation was calculated, the warrior king reduced to a carnival curiosity before the final horrors began. Witnesses reported that Sambhaji maintained a defiant expression, refusing to show fear even as the implements of torture were displayed before him. The execution proceeded in methodical stages. First, the king's eyes were destroyed. Executioners heated iron rods until they glowed red, then pressed them against his eyeballs. The sizzle of cooking ocular fluid was audible to the front rows of spectators. The smell of burning tissue wafted through the crowd. Sambhaji, now blind, remained standing as attendants supported him for the next phase of his punishment. Over the next 2 weeks, pieces of his body were methodically removed. Executioners began with his tongue, slicing it from his mouth while he was fully conscious. Then they took his fingers, one joint at a time. Between mutilations, physicians treated his wounds with cauterizing irons to prevent him from bleeding to death or losing consciousness. Each day, Sambhaji was brought back to the square for a new amputation. Toes, ears, nose, each removed with surgical precision. On the final day, when little remained of the once powerful king, Aurangzeb ordered the conclusion of the spectacle. Sambhaji's skin was flayed from his chest and arms before he was finally beheaded. The severed head was stuffed with straw and displayed on a pike at Delhi's main gate. His dismembered body was thrown to stray dogs who fought over the royal flesh until nothing recognizable remained of the last independent Maratha king.